everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Hi. Welcome. My name is Kitty Drake. I work for The Guardian as a journalist, and I organise The Guardian's weekly Dining Across the Divide column, where we get two people with very different political opinions. So, for example, a Reform voter and a Green voter to sit and have a meal together and try and have a conversation that in some way connects or crosses the divide. So I was very pleased to be approached by The Conduit to interview Emily Kasriel about her wonderful new book, Deep Listening, which is an exploration into the ways that we listen and what we're getting wrong. Emily is an award-winning journalist, editor, and coach. She had a distinguished career at the BBC for more than 2 decades, and she developed the deep listening approach as a senior visiting research fellow at King's College Policy Institute in London, drawing on her experience as an accredited executive coach and workplace mediator. Previously, she's been a visiting fellow at Said Business School at Oxford University and a senior advisor to the Skoll Foundation. We're here to talk about her brilliant book, Deep Listening, in which Emily lays out a roadmap for how to listen to each other properly and explains what we so often get wrong. Why do so many conversations leave us feeling unheard and disconnected? Emily poses this question, and the answer that she kind of begins the book with really is that we've forgotten how to truly listen. It was a really exciting book for me to read because it upended a lot of my perceptions. I see myself as an incredibly good listener, and my friend Ellen's in the audience. I was telling her earlier this week that it made me realise that actually I'm not a very good listener at all. And I've probably been listening wrong the entire time that I've been congratulating myself silently on how good I am at doing it. So I'm really excited to dig into all of that with Emily. We have an hour together tonight, not including question time, which will come at the end. I want to spend the first part of this evening talking to Emily and asking her some questions about the book. And then we're going to do a deep listening demonstration where I don't know what the question is that Emily's going to be putting to a lucky volunteer, guinea pig, in the audience. But she'll be asking you a question and demonstrating deep listening to you. And if nobody volunteers, I will do it. And then there will be a time for each of you to turn to one another, whoever you're sitting next to, and practice the deep listening approach on one another. So it'll be quite an interactive evening. And then we'll have 15 minutes, as I say at the end, for you to grill Emily and deeply listen to her answers.
Or me deeply listen to the question.
Yes, we'll be doing it all. So I wanted to kind of begin. There's a political dimension to this book. You argue very beautifully that if we could find a better way to listen to each other, when we talk about political issues, we might be able to find better solutions to our problems. But I'm also quite interested in the personal dimension as to why you decided to write this book. And I wondered, was there something in your personal life that spurred you towards creating this technique? Were you not listening properly?
Yeah, actually, I think as my family will attest, by nature, and I have got 1 or 2 friends in the audience who might attest that as well, not a brilliant listener. I'm the sort of person who would often interrupt because, after all, I could articulate other people's ideas even better than them, help them complete their sentences, save time. Wasn't that a brilliant gift of mine? And how great did they feel? So I don't think, I've been a great listener, but also when I was 13, my father died. And although there was just enormous kindness from friends and family friends, nobody really asked me how I was. Nobody really listened to how I was feeling at the time. And that sense of being unheard then stayed with me. But also I have had the privilege to witness some brilliant listening. Like just after I started at the BBC and I was the reporter for BBC Africa in Johannesburg, we heard that a situation was unfolding in Pretoria, one of the capitals, one of the administrative capitals of the South African government. So we got into the van, turned up there to find hundreds of soldiers. These were former members of Mkhonto we Sizwe, the ANC's armed guerrilla wing, now integrated into the South African Defence Force, but they were not happy. They felt they didn't get the same rank, they felt the food was rubbish, the housing was bad, but most of all they felt humiliated to be bossed about by these white soldiers, their former enemy. And they were there wanting to see their leader. They wanted to see the new president, Nelson Mandela. So we waited, and I hung out with them, and I interviewed them in English and Swahili. I don't speak Swahili, but I was recording it for colleagues at the BBC. And eventually, we heard the swish of rotating blades in the sky, and we looked up, and we saw the helicopter. So we quickly ran to this hastily elected podium to see what Nelson Mandela would have to say. But he wasn't there. And instead, I found Nelson Mandela walking, trailed by his bodyguards, amongst the soldiers. And he said to one soldier, "Tell me, what is your name? Oh, and where do you live? Yeah, I know Alexandria Township, but which street? Oh, where exactly on that street? And now, tell me why you are here." And only after listening, truly listening to all these soldiers with empathy and respect for well over an hour, did he get onto that podium and address them. And he said to them, "I have heard your grievances. We will look into them. But now you must be disciplined. You must go back to your barracks and help us build the new South Africa." And all of the soldiers did exactly what Nelson Mandela had asked of them. And it's because, I believe, and I kind of felt it at the time even, that they had felt truly heard. They had been listened to. But I should say, actually, that I didn't, particularly really take on this lesson, because I remember not long after I was in Addis Ababa interviewing the president, Meles Zenawi, for BBC Africa. And this was, quite a privilege and a responsibility. And I had been staying at the Guion Hotel, and various dissidents had come to find me out, and over a beer had told me about some horrific human rights abuses that they had endured. So I came to see the president, determined to hold him to account and ask him difficult questions about human rights issues. He, meanwhile, wanted to talk about the quite considerable work that he and his government had done to address poverty and deal with sorghum and other crops and help increase their productivity, which was desperately needed in Ethiopia, which was then, and still is on some level, really very poor, and certainly then a lot of people really hungry. And I wasn't interested in listening. Every time he tried to talk about the wheat or the sorghum or anything else, I said, and returned back to those human rights abuses. I had no curiosity. I wasn't really listening. And as I continued to talk, he went further and further back into his desk. So I had to stretch my microphone further and further, because you need to get the microphone close to someone's mouth when you're recording the interview. And eventually he just cut off the interview early. And I was left. And then actually when he died, I read a response about him as an individual, and he was a complex character, no doubt, with human rights issues, but he was also an extraordinary leader, not just of Ethiopia, but also, in many instances, representing the whole continent. And I realized what a missed opportunity due to my lack of curiosity, my lack of listening.
I was really struck by that story, because I think that so many of us can, and I do it as well, we think that we're listening, but what we're actually doing is either trying to insert and show the person we're listening to that we've understood, or that we're clever enough that they don't even need to explain it to us because we've already got it and we're on the same page, or just try and twist them round to the next question. Like, I feel like that in my life as a journalist. I'm constantly trying to get somebody to answer the question that I've already set out beforehand that that's the one I want answered, and then I feel that I don't actually listen to what they're trying to say. And actually kind of reading this book over the last 2 weeks, I've been having conversations with people in my personal life, and it's almost spun me into this thing of like, do I listen to anyone when they say anything? Like, how do we know when we are truly listening? It's almost like complicating something that we are meant to do instinctively, but what you're saying is actually we've kind of forgotten how to do it. And there's one story that you told me that was about you sitting in a pharmacy and you were having a kind of conversation with somebody, and you did listen in a way, and that allowed them to tell you something that really surprised you and unlock part of themselves. And that was a kind of more personal story, and I wonder whether you could share it with us now.
Sure. So it was just recently, actually, I was just in my local pharmacy picking up some drugs for my daughter, and there was a lady waiting on a blue plastic chair waiting for her own drugs. And the pharmacist asked me for my daughter's birth date, so I said, yeah, it's the 3rd of July, 21. She looked at me. She looked at the drugs, and she said, you sure? And I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, no, that's crazy. It's the 3rd of July, 01. And the lady sitting on the blue chair said, that's pretty silly. How can you not even know the date of your daughter's birthday? And I said, you're quite right. That was pretty foolish of me. I don't think she'd be very pleased had she known about this error. So I was chatting to this lady, and she told me we were talking about birthdays, and she told me about her grandmother who just celebrated her 90th birthday. And she said, yeah, I was really proud. And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, I sense that you're really proud, but at the same time, there's also something else going on. And she was silent for a moment, and then she responded, yeah, I think that I might die before my grandmother. And then she told me about her condition, and we talked about it a bit, and then she started to cry, and then she apologized for crying. We are in Britain, after all. And then she said, thank you so much for listening. And we said goodbye, and we both went our separate ways. And it was just a moment where I happened to be present, and also perhaps because I'd been a bit vulnerable about getting my daughter's name wrong, that she felt comfortable to share and be open about something that was obviously, understandably, weighing so heavily for her. So, it's my hope with the book to encourage more people to deeply listen, not only to their own families and colleagues and the people who are already part of their lives, but also to strangers. Because as you said, so many of us are not heard. The epidemic of loneliness is really so extraordinary. So many people, the only person they talk to is the bus conductor, if that, because these days we don't even talk to the bus. There often isn't a bus conductor. So, I'm hoping that more of us can do it. But I should say, you don't have to do it all the time. For my book, I interviewed Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian Nobel Prize-winning playwright. And he said, I relish my moments of solitude, and we all need solitude. He said, I need to have time to be able to do my creations, even on an aeroplane. I don't always want to listen. And of course, he's quite right. It's not an obligation, but it's an opportunity when the time is right for us to listen to other people.
And can you explain exactly what deep listening is, and why is it different from, listening as we would understand listening?
Yeah, that's a good question, because as you said, often when we're listening, what we're actually doing is preloading our verbal gun with ammunition ready to fire. Anybody ever done that? Huh? Yeah? Or what we do is we listen long enough, as you say, to get the gist of what the person has said and provide a solution. Aren't we fantastic? Haven't we done brilliantly? Aren't we helpful? Actually, men are more likely to do this than women, especially when they don't find out or really listen to what the problem is, or even if the person wants them to provide a solution. Or we try and cheer someone up. That's what we often do, especially to our kids or our close friends, because again, we think that's what we need to do. That's our role. That's how we can help. And in doing so, the person doesn't feel held or heard in what they're actually feeling or experiencing. So I don't know if anybody's been on active listening courses, because I certainly did at the BBC. Anybody been on one of those where you listen and you try and take on board and you go, yeah, I really understand, yeah, and you paraphrase, yeah, you're feeling this, and that is performative. You're not really curious. You're not, listening to the whole of them, because when we deeply listen to someone, it's the whole of us listening to the whole of them. It's listening to ourselves first to realize what's our skin in the game. It's being present and being curious and understanding that we cannot assume we already know what the person is going to say, even if it's our partner who's complaining yet again about his difficult boss, because none of us are the same person we were last year, last week, or even last night. So understanding that we all have the capacity to change can enable all of us to listen in a much more profound way, in order that the speaker, the person we're listening to, can unfold new thoughts and new possibilities. And that, in my mind, is a tremendous gift.
And there's 8 steps to kind of break it down for those who haven't read the book. Can you talk us through briefly those 8 steps and what they actually involve?
Sure. So step 1 is about creating the space. And it's both like, you're trying to listen to somebody. I'm finding it really distracting with the music going on in the background, hard to focus, hard to concentrate. Glass, metal, a lot of bouncy, that's really hard to listen to. Harsh overhead lights, blue, white, not so good. Much better, soft, yellow side lights. But more importantly, it's where people feel safe to talk. So, hey, if you want to find out why your colleague's got issues with timekeeping, not so good in an open plan office, or even if there's a glass divider. Far better to go and have a conversation, go for a walk, even better somewhere in nature. I'm not, by the way, talking about everything. If I was to ask you, would you like a glass of water, and you were going, that would be kind of weird. Yeah, we're talking here about the conversations that really matter, when we've got a relationship to heal, when we have a big difference of opinion, when somebody comes from a really different background, or there's a lot at stake. But actually you can intersperse different steps through all sorts of conversations you have. It's not an all or nothing. You don't either have to do one, all 8 steps, or not bother. So step 2 is listening to yourself first, because it's so important that we take the time to realize what really is at stake for us. What's our real agenda from this conversation? And perhaps our relationship's even more important than the quick win we thought we had to nail them on in this conversation. Sometimes we might find that the reason we feel really uneasy with the person we're going to listen to is that they remind us of our bullying older brother. So when we're sitting listening to them, we're not listening to our colleague, we're listening to our bullying older brother. And again, we're aged 5, like we were in those relationships. And how does that make us feel? And in fact, in the book, which I had fun illustrating, I've done, I think, my favorite picture for this, which is a picture of this woman who is desperate to listen, but she can't, because inside her are all these shadows, these like D-books, to use the shadows as a phrase from Jung, and they are causing havoc. She's desperately trying to listen, if you can look at her expression, but she can't because of all these shadows. And if you can take the time to realize maybe you fear your own selfishness but can't accept it, so you instead projecting it on the other person that you're trying to listen to. Step 3 is about being present. Now, surprise, surprise, your phone is the most distracting thing that can possibly be, because all of these people being paid so many millions of dollars to keep you, even if it's, off, no notifications, that shiny glass screen, you'll still be putting energy into not looking at it. So far better out of sight, even better in another room. But it's also what's going on in our own mind. We're going to be home in time to watch a big match or pick up our kids from school. So purposefully taking the time to be present. And when you notice your mind wanders, because, hey, that's what our mind does, to return it back and listen to the person who is speaking. And step 4 is about being curious. We were talking earlier about understanding that we can't already know what the other person is going to say. How can we look out for things that might surprise us? And when we're curious, truly curious, and the person feels it, they will often reveal more about themselves, which allows us to develop empathy for them as a human being and then respect as well. Step 5 is about the gaze. Now, one reason why Zoom calls and Teams calls are so exhausting is if you're face-to-face, you're mostly about to either kiss somebody or kill them, which is not the most relaxing for conversation. So 60 degrees like we're sitting is ideal, because I can still look at your body language, Kitty. I can look you in the eye, and as you're speaking, what you'll often do is you're going to wander up your eyes, yeah? You're going to have new, rich thoughts, top right, often. But because I'm waiting for you, you will be much more coherent when you return and share far more with me, because it's called a gaze window. You will return to our gaze window. If I start looking away, you'll often have to repeat and begin again what you're about to say. Some cultures, eye contact not so good, and if people are on spectrums of neurodiversity, it can also be challenging. But by and large, and I have worked in deep listening in hundreds of countries around the world, a soft, warm gaze, not like a Michel Foucault gaze of a prison warden. Yeah, we're talking about a warm, soft gaze. So step 6 is about holding the silence. And a lot of people are very reluctant about silence because they think it's awkward, or they think silence is great for extracting value in a negotiation. Actually, if it's a warm-hearted, soft, welcoming silence, it allows new thoughts to emerge. And often it will feel more uncomfortable for the listener than the speaker, and you can get better at it. And you're going to practice it, actually, in our little exercise. And the other great thing about silence is it allows you to make meaning from what the speaker has just shared with you. So you can then respond for step 7, reflect back, and sum up the very core of what they've said. So not just paraphrasing, not just the words, but also what's between the words, but you feel is really critical, and emotions as well. And by doing this, you check in, because you might get it wrong, and that's fine, because they'll say, no, it's not this, but it is that. And so you will have this iterative process and go deeper in order to go to step 8, which is about going deeper to get to people's values, motivations, needs. And in doing so, you can start listening with your third ear, which is a term coined by Theodor Reich, who was a student of Sigmund Freud in Vienna and later went to work as a psychoanalyst in New York. And he talked about the third ear. It's not like our 2 ears either side of our brain. They're intellectually listening. But our third ear, I like to think of it near our heart, to really use all of ourselves, perhaps even our unconscious, to catch those very small moments in somebody's thinking and reply and respond, to reflect back to them with humility to see if we've got it right.
And can you tell me a little bit about the invention process for deep listening? Because I know that you've tested it quite thoroughly, but I first wanted to ask a little bit about, did you come up with this? Yeah. And who are your main influences?
So the term was actually popularized by Pauline Oliveros, who was this fantastic musician, and I listened to her music when I was writing the book, and she recorded an album. I think it was 20 feet down in a cistern, and she called this album Deep Listening, and she talked about listening not only to music, she was a musician and a composer, but also to sounds and acoustic sounds and the earth. And she was a really beautiful thinker. But my work, I've drawn on a lot of thinkers and a lot of academic research. Carl Rogers, who was an American person-centered psychologist, is probably the biggest single influence. But I've talked to, visited Japanese tea ceremonies and Canadian First Nation leaders in Canada, and actually having the privilege of being listened to myself, because lots of First Nations in different countries have evolved ways of listening which draw upon heritages, and they actually have very specific words for deep listening in different cultures. And so it makes me think that perhaps we were all once deep listeners. But of course, the modernity and life and urbanization has deprived us of that opportunity.
And you've also, it's kind of an evidence-based approach. You've tested the system quite rigorously. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So when I was at the BBC, we wanted to do something big. I was kind of number 2 on the BBC's centenary project. So I thought it would be really fun to do a really big deep listening project. And I reached out to the British Council, and we recruited 1,000 people in 100 countries. And it was a really diverse group of people, because the countries most represented were the UK, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Iran. A mate of mine runs the BBC Persian service, so used Telegram to recruit lots of Iranians. They all had to be English speakers in order to do the project, which was virtual. And I was going to train them for 2 hours one week, 2 hours the next week, and 2 hours the final week. And then I thought, this is crazy. I don't want to do something this big without actually seeing if it works. So I reached out to some academics at the University of Reading, and they reached out to others at the University of Haifa. And we set up a control group. They randomly selected participants to have a really difficult conversation around a subject that they disagreed with, and compared their responses to people who'd had the 3 weeks of training and had a very, very exactly similar type of very difficult conversation. And what we found, and the results have been published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Applied Social Psychology, your bedtime reading, not. But it really, I don't know, I have to say I found reading a lot of this academic literature really tough going, because it's not really about being, it's not really read to be compelling or interesting. But what they did find was that people who practiced deep listening felt more connected, felt more understood, and I think this is the really exciting bit, felt more open to re-examine their own attitudes. And that's what we have found in other studies, actually, not my own, that people who are properly and well listened to reduce what's called their attitude extremity, because they no longer need to feel so defensive, so they become more open to the possibility of other ideas and other perspectives.
So, as you say, if we deep listen to everyone, we'd probably go mad. What would you say in our personal lives? What would be the conversations that you would suggest we apply this technique to, the kind of big conversations, and where should we not deep listen?
I would say, and I've got 2 chapters about kind of ethics and safety. If you don't feel safe, either psychologically or even physically, it's not good to deeply listen, because you are opening yourselves up. And if you feel somebody's abusive or exploitative, that's not good. You need to protect yourself. You also need to protect the person speaking, because when you deeply listen, you'll often find that they perhaps share more than they intended. So you have ethical obligations on what you do with that information. But I think in our personal lives, relationships, they're the very fibre of our existence. They determine how happy we are in the world. They determine not only our mental health, but also our physical health. And by listening to the people who we are most intimate with, our partner, our kids, our parents, our siblings, our friends, we can be there for them. We can understand them better, and we can get out of those scripted conversations, which were often, like when your partner comes home and you say, "How was your day?" And they go, "Yeah, all right." And you say, "Well, let me tell you about the dog and what's happened in the Labour Party and the rubbish cleaner and all these other, why the rubbish men didn't clear up or whatever." You just bombard them because you're not really there. But instead you can say, "It sounds like your day was a bit mixed." And then suddenly you're having a real authentic conversation. That's just momentary, because it doesn't have to take that long to have a proper conversation. Like, let's say you're at work and your boss asks you to do an extra project. Can you get it done for Wednesday? And you go, "Yeah, sure." And your mouth is smiling, but not your eyes. And he can say, "Great, fantastic. I look forward to it." Or he might say, So I'm sensing that perhaps there's something else going on, but you're not feeling comfortable to be open about it. Suddenly, again, you're having a real conversation, and you can say, no, it's fine. Or you can say, well, I'll do that, but it means I can't do the other project. And your boss says, bloody hell, thank God you mentioned that. The other project's far more important. It's about having authentic conversations. But your kids, and they come home from school and you say, how was your day? And they go, oh, it was horrible. The teacher picked on me again. And I know, when I used to do this with my kids, I might say, I'm sure it wasn't so bad. You only felt like they were picking on you. I'm sure maybe the teacher was being quite fair. And, did the teacher pick on anybody else? Yeah, anybody ever done that sort of thing as a parent? Yeah. But instead, you can say, and what's so important when you deeply listen, you don't have to demonstrate that you agree. Yeah. So you don't have to say, yeah, so the teacher really picked on you. But instead you could say, so it felt like the teacher was really picking on you and that upset you. And suddenly you're giving an opportunity for your child to talk about what's going on in their life and to be real about it. And they'll say, yeah, it was awful. And she shouted at me and I hate that. And then somebody else teased me because of it. And suddenly, you're actually finding out what's going on in their lives rather than through probing questions, which is what we often do and where kids especially, but a lot of us, clam up.
But what do you do if in your head you're really thinking, oh, you're always complaining, and maybe not about your child, but if your partner, because it strikes me as you're talking that I think that the people we are least likely to have deep conversations with are actually the ones that we're closest to and that we live with, because there's something about the intimacy of living together that means that somehow when you're just trying to relax or switch off, the idea of having a really deep conversation about how that day is, you're just like, I can't do that every night, But I was wondering, what do you do if your partner starts telling you, when you deep listen to them, that they've had this terrible day, and you're just thinking in your head, but you're moaning, and you're always moaning about the same things, and I'm fed up with it. What do you do with that critical voice that doesn't want to hear?
I think that's a really interesting question. And clearly, if you've had a bloody awful day and your partner's going every single night talking about their awful day, you might want to be real and just say, I really want to hear about what's happened with you, but I've also just to kind of label that I've had a tough time too, be real. But it's also interesting to be introspective. Sometimes when we're really irritated, it's again because perhaps we fear that we are moany, and so we're not able to deal with our partner's moaningness, for example. It's often the stuff we get most irritated by is about ourselves. So it's an opportunity to reflect and say, why am I bored? What's really going on? Or why am I feeling irritated? And sometimes the reasons we listen can be really surprising. There's an incident I write about in the book where I went to interview my friends of my father when my daughter I was off on maternity leave with her. And it's a very close friend of my father, and he was also a refugee, like my father. And he had, and it was a long time ago before mobile, so in his office he had these 4 different landline telephones. And I was talking to him about my father, and as I was talking and sharing memories, he not only picked up one of these phones when it rang, but he also seized the phone and issued instructions to people in his office. And I just couldn't believe it. This was such an important conversation. This guy's no longer alive, Willie. And I knew he wouldn't last forever. And we had the opportunity to share some really profound insights so I could get to know my father better. And eventually I said to him, listen, Willie, what is going on? I don't understand. This conversation is important to me. Why are you choosing to interrupt it as I am speaking? And he was silent for a while. And then he said, I'm finding this conversation really, really hard. I loved your father. And then immediately everything changed. He relaxed. He understood what was going on himself. And we were able to share a lot. And I found out a lot of things about my father, some of them not so good, but that I hadn't known before. And it was because Willie hadn't listened to himself before we began the conversation, and it was love that stopped him from listening, which was surprising.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking,
You're slightly off mic, I think.
Oh, am I? Sorry. Thank you. As you're talking, I'm thinking that maybe we don't deeply listen because we don't want to realize that maybe we don't want to hear the people who are closest to us, or I don't know, that we're frightened of really listening and then being either bored or frustrated. And so a lot of our interactions are, you know, small talk of like, hello, how are you? Which is just talking to each other, but isn't remotely communicating. And it's almost, you're talking in order not to communicate. And what I feel with this book is it's quite challenging, because it's telling you talk only to communicate, and actually there are moments when you should be silent. And the silence step for me, I think, was the most difficult one, because as a journalist you're always taught, when you ask someone a question, be quiet afterwards for 10 seconds, almost as a threatening technique, because they're so frightened of silence that you'll say, oh, did you really love your mother? And then you stay silent, and then they go, no, I didn't, you know, because they just want to fill the silence. They're so frightened, they want to tell you something. But you're using silence in a different way as a deep listener, not as a threat, not as something to be filled, but to signal to the person who's speaking that you really want to hear more. And I wonder, like, we're going to demonstrate in a moment, but can you tell me, how do you make that silence non-threatening?
It's a good question, and I think you're quite right. We often talk in order not to have real connection or real communication, and it's often because we ourselves feel uncomfortable and scared, and it can be really challenging to do deep listening, because you might find out things that are shocking to you, that are a different way of thinking, that challenge your assumptions of who you are. So we protect ourselves by feeling safe and comfortable. I think when we use silence, and it is interesting, because when I've trained people in deep listening in so many different contexts, and some people say it feels awkward, but I think feeling relaxed yourself, and it's not just about making the speaker feel respected or about trying to grab and elicit and extract more information. It's giving them time to think. It's allowing both of us to reduce our blood pressure, reduce our heartbeat, feel less defensive, and there's a lot of research around that. And even in negotiations, where people think that silence is there to extract a better deal from someone, there was a paper that came out in 2021 called Silence is Golden, which demonstrated that when both parties in negotiation were asked to remain silent for 20 seconds, number one, no one did 20 seconds. We always overestimate the number of seconds of silence, but also the parties who were asked to be silent came out with many more win-win outcomes, where both parties benefited, rather than zero-sum, if I win, you lose.
Yes, so I guess it's about kind of, because the way I use silence in my professional life is to make them feel awkward or frightened. Honestly, though, I'm just thinking about why I do it. It's to make them feel awkward and frightened, and so therefore, in order to stop the awkwardness and the fear, they fill that silence.
But I mean, the question is, as a journalist, what do you want to hear from people? Do you want to hear things that they are going to admit, or do you want to know what's really going on in their lives?
I think a mixture of both, but in my personal life, I want to hear what people are really feeling. But it's interesting, because I think the reason why I find the silence so, that's the thing I find hardest about my job, leaving the silence, because I also hate making people feel uncomfortable, because I'm usually just interviewing like a nice member of the public about either their sex life or kind of, you know, their voting preferences or something, and I want them to feel good. And so then it's like, I can't bloody shut up. Like, I like want to fill the silence, and then I'm like, no, let them speak. Or occasionally I use it as a kind of grenade. I just think I'm personally very frightened of silence.
You can get really better at it, because I used to be rubbish at silence. And I think it was training to be a coach. And two things. Number one, I realized that when I was interrupting people and coming in, I was assuming that what I was about to say was more important than what they were about to think. And that feels really arrogant, and that felt uncomfortable. But also, when you do give people the space, I wouldn't think of it as silence, because silence feels like a vacuum, whereas in fact it's a spaciousness. Perhaps reframe it as a spaciousness you're giving them, you're gifting them, and they will then tell you things you just didn't expect. And that feels really, really exciting.
Yeah. And just before we go into the first demonstration, I wanted to ask one other question, which is that, you acknowledge in the book, because there's one point where you suggest the time when you're trying to create space, like the right space and the right kind of atmosphere, you suggest doing a meditation before you start listening to someone. And you acknowledge that can sound kind of pretentious, or, I'm imagining going home to my hypothetical partner and being like, before we talk about why you never unload the dishwasher, I'm going to meditate, just so I can really be it's almost like, you acknowledge that can sound self-indulgent, or
even be, come across as.
Yes, exactly. And complicating something that we all do instinctively. Why do we even need to get back, but I just kind of wanted to put that to you, why isn't it an indulgence? Why is it actually urgent that we do this?
Well, I think we don't have to tell everybody we're having or sit in a kind of position and go, ooh, before you're about to have a conversation. That would be really weird, yeah, at home or at work. We can just take a breath in and a breath out in order to center ourselves. A silent breath. No one else needs to know that you're doing that. But it feels so urgent and so important, because not only are people not being heard and there's loneliness, we look what's going on in polarization. I've spent a lot of time in America this year talking to Trump supporters and talking to Democrats, and there's so much fear, there's so much not engagement with the other. And I'm not talking about the politicians who've got, their own agendas. I'm talking about ordinary people. And yet even there, I was just in a couple of weeks ago, just after Charlie Kirk's murder in Poughkeepsie, which is quite a Republican town. I was spending a week at Vassar College, which is an elite university, although 80% of people have some financial aid. But I went out of the university compound to find out what ordinary people, and particularly Republicans, were thinking about Charlie Kirk's murder. And I came across two women. One was in her late 60s, one in her early 60s. And I said, can I just chat with you and find out what you think? And the younger woman said, yeah, Charlie Kirk, he was such a hero. I know so many young people who were really, really inspired by him. And the other woman, who it transpired was her sister, said, I think he was sharing a lot of prejudiced views. And then the younger woman, who was much more confident, was telling me, and I asked her if she supported Trump, and she said she had voted for him, and she believed particularly on immigrants, it was so important. And I asked her younger sister, who said, I don't know much about politics, I'm not so confident, I don't really understand things, but I sense he was a bit misogynist. She struggled with the word. And I don't feel happy about that when I looked into it, and I didn't vote for him. So I was talking for a while more about these two sisters who had a very close relationship and felt very differently about politics. And then I said goodbye, and I went to the laundromat to try and talk to some more people. And the younger sister, the Trump supporter woman, came out and found me and gave me a hug. And she said, thank you so much for listening to us. We felt really heard not only as individuals, but together, that we are so close as sisters, even though our politics are so divided. And that felt to me like a moment of hope at this time, when I spoke to so many Democrat friends who, they said, well, maybe I go and talk to Republicans, but where do I find them? I don't know any of them in New York, And in fact, when I was in DC a few months ago, I tried to find some people, and I did find one. I did track down a Republican bar, but otherwise, because it's a very Democrat city, people aren't feeling comfortable to speak openly. People are not having these conversations, but they need to on Thanksgiving, because so many families are mixed, like everywhere. And obviously America is an extreme case, and Trump is a politician who we haven't yet got in this country. But it feels to me that it is so urgent that more of us make an effort to listen more to people who think differently and try and understand them so they feel heard. When I was in the US at an inauguration in January, loads of people uncle had T-shirts. I was lining up with them for hours just before the inauguration to try and get into the Capital One Arena. And the T-shirt said, "Finally, we have been heard." And I think it's really important, with the rise of the far right and lots of extreme parties, to make more of an effort to listen to people who are not heard in order to create, in order to be able to challenge extreme perspectives in people.
Yeah, and even I think sometimes in my own life, I don't want to engage in a conversation with somebody who thinks politically differently to me, because I feel this terrible, the onerous responsibility of having to try to change their mind in that moment. And actually what I found quite inspiring about your book was that it suggested engage in those conversations not with the prior aim of changing that person's mind, but just in listening to them. And maybe even just by listening to them, you might, end up changing their mind because they won't feel so alienated, and you won't feel so alienated by them.
And not only them, it will reduce their attitude extremity. That's what's so exciting. By not, it's kind of obliquity. I don't know if you know John Kay's book on obliquity. It's like by not attempting to change their mind, they're more likely to be open to your perspective.
Yeah, and even if you don't end up changing one another's mind, it might be quite nice to realise that the person who votes reform, who happens to be your uncle, isn't a monster, and you can listen to them and you can, hear what they have to say without it killing either of you, and feel a bit more connected.
Yeah, and recognise their humanity, because they are your uncle.
My uncle actually doesn't vote reform, just to be clear. He is a Tory, though, so we'll see. Okay, so we're going to do a demonstration now. Does anyone feel like they would like to volunteer to be deeply listened to?
Shall I? I'll tell you the question, yeah? Because otherwise it's not fair. You don't know what the hell I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you, what food reminds you of home? So I'm just going to ask you that question, and you say what you say, and I'll see if I can deeply listen. The main thing is, you're not judging the person, the volunteer, you're judging me to see how well you think that I've done in doing these 8 steps, yeah? And we can have a discussion about it afterwards. Is that okay? Does anybody like to volunteer? If not, Kitty is on the line. So if you want to save Kitty, get up here. What do you think? Anybody up for volunteering? I can see you want Kitty to volunteer, don't you?
I can go up.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Kitty, would you mind giving this lady, what's your name?
My name's Mariah.
Mariah?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Can you give Mariah your mic?
Okay, Mariah. Thank you.
Do you want to come and sit here? Thank you. First of all, should we just give Mariah a round of applause and thank her? Thank you so much. So these guys don't exist, yeah? We'll get rid of them. So you've got to be quiet. Shh. And I'm going to ask you, Mariah, what food, and if you just put your microphone up so everybody can hear you, what food reminds you of home?
The first thing that I thought of was probably a broccoli cheddar cheese casserole, which doesn't sound great. It's not visually appealing at all. But I picked that because my mom hates it, my dad loves it, and I was just so obsessed with being my dad's favorite child that I forced myself to like it. And I feel like I lied myself so many years, I ended up loving it myself. And so when I think of something that reminds me of home, it's those fun conversations of trying to convince myself that I liked it and listen to my mom complain about having to make it and smell it, and my dad being so excited to be able to eat it at dinner. I haven't had it in years, but that was just the first thing that I thought of.
And so it's a memory that comes with some ambiguity of you desperately wanting to get your father's approval and pick up on this conflict between your parents?
Yeah, I just think I love my dad so much that really anything that I could do to bond with him was something I was gonna do, even if it was a nasty casserole. I was just going to like that casserole. If it was a video game I didn't care for, I liked the video game. A history fact was gonna spew on me, I was gonna listen to it. And so that food is the first thing I think of.
And so even though you didn't actually like the casserole, and you, on one level, you identified with your mother who didn't like cooking it, who hated the smell, so there was that love and warmth and empathy, and at the same time, you just so wanted to be loved and approved of by your dad?
Yeah, I think that really just kind of, it was kind of like fun moment of just like almost like, I guess creating this like fun environment of my mom kind of poking fun at us because she, again, detested the dish itself, but would still make it because she loved us. I think that added another layer of like creating that kind of warm environment, I guess. Yeah, I think it was a lot of layers to it, but yeah.
And so it was quite playful. It was almost like you were enacting your roles, like your mum knew that there was some playing going on.
Yeah, I think also, she would also sometimes volunteer to make the dish, but I'd have to ask sometimes. I think she maybe also kind of appreciated like the dynamic that we created on the nights we had it. I think it just kind of creates this like warm feeling. It's not even about the dish, because again, did not care for it. It's more so like the environment and the memories around it, I think, and what like the space it created for us to have those fun moments, I think. Yeah.
And so it was a language that you all spoke and you all knew, and it was an intimacy of knowing that, and your mother loving you both so much, despite her hatred for this dish. She warmed to it, and you appreciated that as well as the love of your father.
Yeah, I think that really, truly kind of comes as what that meant to me, what I think of when I think of that dish in that moment. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Mariah.
No,
thank you.
you.
Should we give it a clap? So, wait a second. Apart from being a bit weird, how did that process feel like for you?
Sorry.
Apart from the fact it's weird, it's not a one-to-one.
I think it was, one, interesting to kind of like go back through, because I have not thought of that in probably forever. Because again, didn't care for the dish, so I'm not making it now, and I'm not eating it now. So it was fun to kind of think back on that. And I think the questions are quite helpful in terms of like guiding of like, I don't know if I necessarily like realized that like there was multiple social dynamics happening in that, so that was kind of eye-opening, I guess, to be able to look back and see it in another way of like multiple social layers on top of me and my dad having that kind of moment.
And roughly how many questions did I ask you? Roughly, just roughly.
3 or 4, maybe.
Any thoughts? How many? Yeah, 1. I asked her what food reminded her of home. Now, I'm a journalist. I want to know the recipe. I want to know where you grew up. I want to know if there were other siblings. I had a whole lot of questions going in my mind, but I didn't. Had I done that, I wouldn't have found out this fascinating stuff. I feel I know you now. Mm-hmm. I feel connected to you because you've shared, I thought you were going down one direction, but then you went down in a different direction because your mum was in on it.
Yeah.
And I understood that because I didn't ask my questions. And I think, we're so programmed, especially as journalists, but even as not, to have great questions and ask them. And by doing so, it doesn't mean we never ask questions, yeah? Of course, we've got to ask questions in our work, in our life, but it means that we can at times let the other person take the steering wheel and go where Mariah wanted to go rather than take her down where I wanted to go. Because I used to love my questions, yeah? I thought they were the best questions ever, but I've realized that they weren't. They were my questions, and I wanted to maintain control and show off by how brilliant they are. And this methodology hands power to the person who is speaking. So thank you. Any questions or thoughts about that process, by the way?
I just wanted to ask, I had a feeling that Mariah was holding back her tears, which I might be completely wrong about. But if that were true, would that be something I would say? I feel like you're holding back your tears.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on it, because I had that sense that it was quite emotional, but also I was also aware that it didn't feel appropriate to say that in a public space. But I think it depends, yeah? If you're in a work context and you're aware, let's say you're the boss and there's a power dynamic, you might not want to say that, but you might say, are you sure you want to continue? Are you finding this a bit intimate? Perhaps we've gone somewhere that you're not quite comfortable. Do you want to just stop it there? and give people an option. But it is about picking up on the noise in the room that's not the official answer, because you're looking at all the way that you're communicating it. So you were doing some brilliant deep listening there. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Anything I didn't do so well, or anything you felt less comfortable with?
Hi, yeah, thank you for being here. It's really interesting. I'm interested in and this is a very coachy type perspective, but I'm interested in kind of like the interpretation, or the person who's in your position's interpretation.
Yeah.
Because I'm not quoting here, but what I heard was, I'm so sorry I've forgotten the lady's name. What's the lady's
Mariah.
name? Mariah was saying, where's the effect of I love my dad so deeply? And then your kind of reflection was, you wanted your dad's love so much. And I kind of noticed that, because I thought that may very well be true. No one knows. But how is that affecting the back and forth?
Yeah, that's a really clever nuance to pick up on, because you're right. I did make an assumption there, and all I can say is that I did my best not to, but inevitably we do. That's what we do, and we bring our own stuff. But I think it's about, as far as we can consciously do that, letting our own stuff go, and also being comfortable when somebody says, not quite, because they often do, and allowing, not getting fixated on our own interpretations. But thank you for picking up on that. I think you're right. No, I mean, it is interesting. Yeah, I mean, obviously I didn't do that terribly successfully. So, I mean, it's a nuanced point, but you're right. I mean, often when we listen, particularly if we disagree, like let's say we're having a conversation about cycling. I cycled here, I'm a cyclist. Imagine you hate cycles, you're a black cab driver. Some of them like cycles, but a lot of them don't. And you're telling me about, the new cycle routes, and you're telling me about all the reason they're so frustrating and they're so slow in your cab. But, you did mention that your partner can cycle quicker to work. And I ignore all the stuff you disagree with, and I say, someone really feels like your partner is liberated to get to work super speedily. I mean, that's not authentic, yeah? That is cherry picking the bits that you want in order to make your argument stronger. How much are you, Mrs. Black Cab Driver, going to be feeling hurt?
I want to just circle back to your question slightly, because when you just said there that was maybe your stuff, and you were projecting your own experience onto the person you were listening to.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that would be an example of what you would call a shadow. So one of the steps is listening to yourself, and if you're going to talk to somebody about their upbringing, maybe having a word with yourself before and thinking, maybe this will bring up stuff about my upbringing, and I shouldn't put that into the conversation. But then actually, when I was just listening to you do that and reflecting on the exchange, doesn't that kind of strip an interaction from its humanity? Because it's like the fact that maybe you projected some of your personal experience there onto the person you were listening to, that felt real and like important. Is there a danger by addressing all of our shadows and making sure we don't put anything on the other person that we're not going to communicate with them, or we make ourselves into robots or something?
I don't think there's a danger. I think that we're all far too complicated to ever be stripped back of anything. I think we bring the whole of us to any exchange, whether we speak or we listen. I think, unless you're a super, super experienced psychoanalyst who has just got a sort of absolutely, which is what psychoanalysts are supposed to do, completely straight face. I'm talking about ordinary people having ordinary conversations here. I don't think that is a risk. I think that we are inevitably, we try not to, but we bring our own experiences to meaning make what the other person is saying. But what's most important is that we're not like, so you loved your father too much. It's because, it's when we're got too much vested in it That's when we really need to listen to ourselves first, because we're bringing our own stuff and our own emotions. We'll always bring our own interpretations and meaning make and allow the person to say, yes, but not quite. And often people will do that and say, but, and then they will go deeper to what they actually do feel and think.
Okay, brilliant. I think we've got time for us to do a practical where everyone in the audience does it on their own in pairs. And I'm going to hand over to Emily to just remind us how to deep listen briefly and kind of set up this section.
Thank you, Kitty. So I'd like you to find somebody you don't already know, yeah? And if you haven't found somebody, just put your hand up. And if you don't want to participate, just remain seated and don't put your hand up. But please do, because it's fun. You ask the person with the name earliest in the alphabet is the listener, and ask the speaker to tell me something which reminds you of home. And make sure, Mariah, that you are the listener, not the speaker, in your pair. And the most important things to remember, don't worry about all 8 steps. Reflect back after 10 seconds of silence, which will feel weird. Reflect back not just the words, but the meaning of what you have understood, including their emotions and what's not expressed in words, and iteratively see where you go. If the other person just says macaroni cheese and refuses to tell me anymore, one question you can ask is tell me more, because more allows you to go deeper rather than tell me what else, which goes sideways. So if people are up for having a go, put up your hand and then find somebody else with a hand, and then who you don't already know, and to stand up, and we'll have 4 minutes on the timer. Yeah?
I'll tell you when the time's up. I actually noticed, Emily, that you did not wait 10 seconds. But was that for the purposes of the...
Yeah, I think you're quite right. Well caught.
Shall I try and do it to you? Yeah, no, definitely very. I don't think anyone can hear us. So I think it was my mum used to make for our birthday. We had to choose what to have, and so she made. So I'm going to ask you different questions. I feel like you've thought about this a lot. Okay. And I want to ask you something which you're not expecting. Okay. Then I'm worried I'm going to emotion stuff. When was the last time you cried? Is that too much or have to stop? Yeah, though that's a bit. Okay. When was the last time you missed a flight? I missed a flight many, many years ago when I was flying between Bangladesh and China, and I was at university, and I had a wait in Hong Kong. So I was with a friend going to Thailand. That was it. We went to Bangladesh before, but we were in Thailand on a holiday, and then I was doing a university field trip. I studied geography in China, and I missed the flight. And because I was just waiting in the airport, and I wasn't that good at taking aeroplanes and things. And then I remember bursting into tears when they told me, and then they gave me another flight and upgraded me, so it was actually quite nice. I felt quite frightened and helpless at the time, though, before they gave me the next flight. A bit useless, a bit rubbish.
So, everybody, just drawing your deep listening to a close. Emily, I think you have a few, you wanted to maybe recap and ask people what they found tricky.
Or even what they found interesting. What was it like as a speaker? What was it like as a listener? We've only got a couple of minutes till 8 o'clock, but just interested in any questions that came out of that experience or reflections on anything you tried that you hadn't tried before and what happened. Or whether you're completely unconvinced. You can be honest. There's a lady in the back. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the exercise and for sharing about your book. It's super interesting. My name is Male, and we have an experience. It went super deep, super quick. That is a surprise, and now I understand your ethics chapter because, what am I gonna do with all of this? Well, it struck me, and the reason I put my hands up is because the 10 seconds is super long. And at some point I was counting and starting to feel that the other person was getting nervous. I think the Katie, you asked that question before. How do you make that silence not a weapon?
You don't have to do 10 seconds. I was inviting you to do 10 seconds to see, to play, to stretch, because it's like it's a game. In reality, 2, 3, 5 seconds. I was, working with Hollywood executives, and they said, we don't do 10 seconds, we do quick, witty retorts. And it depends on the culture that you're working with. But just try and leave a little gap, because it's not silence, it's spaciousness. And if you think about it like that, it allows you to relax. But you don't have to count for 10. I was inviting you to do this, just try something a little uncomfortable, because, hey, if you can't do 10 in a practice session, how are you going to do 3 in the real world? So there's a lady over here.
Just a reflection from having done that very lovely exercise with my very lovely conversation partner. I think that there's something here about empathetic imagination, which is really important to deep listening. And I think that resolves maybe some of the questions earlier around where is that line of self-projection and self-negation. And actually, if you're a therapist, you are there trying to remove every trace of yourself in order not to cloud the experience of your client. But as a listener, you are bringing your empathy and that empathetic imagination into the space between you, and that's a great act of generosity, I always think. But it does also make me wonder about the skill of the empathetic imagination and the degree to which we nurture that. And I wonder how you think about that as something innate or developed.
It's a beautiful way you put it, empathetic imagination. And it allows us to make meaning from what we're being offered. But I would say, and I used to do this all the time, if somebody was telling me a story and I'd had a similar situation, I'd say, so interesting you say that, because do you know what happened to me? And what I would do is change the spotlight from them to me, and I'd stop listening. And therefore, I advise people not to do that, even if you know exactly what the person has experienced, because you've experienced it yourself. The invitation is not to share that until afterwards, to really allow the person to unpack the meaning of their experience for them, because it's unique. And only later, maybe even in another meeting or another conversation or email, do you say, I so resonated with what you said because of my own experience. I mean, I think that we can all develop this meaning making. It's something which I certainly have developed it a lot as a coach, and then since doing this deep listening work, and it just feels really exciting. It's like the most exciting thing there is. And I've actually also started a course of psychoanalytical psychotherapy at the Tavistock 2 weeks ago, because I'm particularly interested in meaning making and understanding what other people say. But the deep listening work is for everybody. You're not a therapist. You're not pretending to be. I am not a therapist. I've written the book on a lot of research, but not based on expecting people to be experts, but just to feel comfortable to how far they feel like they want to go.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap up.
Thank you so much. And it slightly links to what you just said. But isn't deep listening privilege to the affluent and the educated, those who understand their shadows because they've done counseling or they've done retreats, and therefore they have the privilege to become good at it? And I speak from experience because I've done all these things.
I think I've discovered in my work that all sorts of people can be brilliant listeners who aren't privileged. You know, I think that's what's so exciting. I've done some work doing deep listening with people who are really experienced execs, and then people who come from a minority communities, because it was part of an NGO working with them together. And it was remarkable often that expertise and privilege can get in the way of listening, because you feel caught up in your role to solve, your role to dictate, your role to prescribe. And actually, I think we can all have ability to listen, and it comes from unexpected places. Sometimes children are better listening than their parents. That's what I believe, and that's what I've experienced.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much to Emily for writing this book and for doing this talk with us.
You're very welcome. And I should say, by the way, that I not only will sign books, I will also paint you your own little image in your book, if you would like, at the back.
I've got one, and it's amazing.
I bought my brush and paint, so if you're interested, I'm happy to do that. And thank you so much for being such a brilliant, participatory, challenging, fantastic audience. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.